Alrighty, students, we're back with question number 6, and this question deals with the Fed and its influence on the money supply. So part A says that assume the Federal Reserve targets a lower federal funds rate. So the federal funds rate, of course, is the rate of interest that banks charge one another. While this is not directly controlled by the Fed, of course, can seek to influence this rate primarily through the use of open market operations, or OMOs. So in this case, what OMO would the Fed engage in order to achieve a lower federal funds rate, or just lower interest rates generally? And the answer here is they would buy bonds. Buy bigger, that would increase the money supply. So once again, if we were using a graph to help us to understand this question better, it would be again a graph of the money market with a vertical money supply, downward sloping money demand, and this would then be reflected, this purchase of bonds, as a rightward shift of the money supply curve, giving us a lower nominal interest rate. The next part of the question says, given the buying of bonds, the answer from part A, what will happen to the price of government bonds? And so as we discussed in the previous question, interest rates and bond prices are inversely related. So because we are seeking here lower interest rates, the bond prices will increase. Another way to think about this is that as the Fed seeks to buy bonds, they will be increasing the demand for bonds, which will have the effect of increasing bond prices. So this action, this open market purchase of bonds, will increase bond prices. Part B of the question then says, explain the effect of the open market operation from part A on the nominal interest rate. And as mentioned earlier, the whole point here of engaging in open market purchase of bonds is to lower the nominal interest rate. So this would obviously be in response to a recession or fears of a recession. This would be an example of an expansionary monetary policy action by the Fed. So again, the goal here, the effect here will be lower nominal interest rates. Part C then says, assume that the Federal Reserve buys government bonds from commercial banks. Based only on this transaction, will the level of required reserves in the commercial banks increase, decrease, or remain the same? So as they stress in the question, based only on this transaction, the level of required reserves in commercial banks will remain the same. Any money that comes into or leaves banks as a result of Fed open market operations are not subject to the reserve requirement, and so therefore there will be no change to the required reserves, the amount of money the banks have to set aside from typical deposits. So if you and I were to put money in the bank, that money would be subject to the reserve requirement. That would change the required reserves in a bank. However, any money that comes from the Fed or leaves banks as a result of open market operations, in this case, money would be coming in. As the Fed buys bonds, the money supply would get bigger, but none of that is subject to the reserve requirement, and therefore no change in required reserves. And then the last question simply asks us to define the discount rate. So this is the rate of interest that the Fed charges banks at the so-called discount window. This is another of the Fed's monetary policy tools that it can use. In this case, they would want to change or lower the discount rate to match the lower federal funds rate. Again, the Fed can't directly lower the federal funds rate, but they can directly lower the discount rate. The third monetary policy tool, although not mentioned here, is the reserve requirement, which the Fed in this case, in keeping with seeking to lower interest rates, they would also lower the reserve requirement. That would be their third expansionary monetary policy option. Although that's not asked about here, certainly something to keep in mind. So that's question number 6, guys, and we'll see you soon. Alrighty, be well.